So I'll just start out with a little bit of an introduction. I started my work, I started photographing when I was about 21. And when I was 25 years old, I was curious about the situation for women in Afghanistan. I knew that the Taliban was in power and that there were very few rights awarded to women. And I had a roommate at the time who said, "You care about women's issues." I was living in India. He said, "Why don't you go to Afghanistan and see what their lives are really like?" And so I didn't think twice. I didn't have any money, so I called my sister and asked her to borrow $2,000. And I called my mother and I said, "Mom, I'm gonna go to Afghanistan tomorrow." And she said, "Okay, honey, have a good time." Because of course, no one really knew what the situation was in Afghanistan at the time. It was before September 11th. So I went, and photography was illegal. So I walked around with my cameras in a bag, and I took out my camera whenever I could, terrified the Taliban would catch me. But as a woman, I was able to sneak into people's homes and get access to women and hear about their lives. The hospitals at the time were completely empty. There was no medicine, very few doctors. This is a woman in labor under the Taliban. This is what the situation looked like. And these are secret girls' schools of women and men who opened up their homes to girls to be educated because it was illegal to educate girls at the time. So that trip really sparked my desire to cover humanitarian issues and human rights abuses around the world. I wasn't scared because I really believed that if my intentions were pure and that if I was doing something to be honest, that I would be fine. So after September 11th happened, I asked the New York Times if I could go and cover the fall of the Taliban. I was in Kandahar when the Taliban fell, and there were men who were in prison so long they had no idea the Taliban had even come and gone from power. Before the war in Iraq, it was clear we were going to war in Iraq, and I raised my hand to go. I wasn't sure if I could cover combat, if I would have the stomach. So I snuck in through Iran into northern Iraq and waited for the humanitarian crisis. We thought there would be a surge of refugees coming from Baghdad. That did not happen. Instead, there was a proxy war with Al-Ansar going on, and we covered that. Soon Saddam Hussein fell in April of 2003. And we were there, and the horrors of the war became unveiled. There were civilian casualties, these are mass graves, and people would look for their loved ones by going through these white sheets and looking for their bodies. This is a woman looking for her husband in a fire at a propane factory. So all across the country, there was looting, chaos. People were very frustrated. They had no access to water, electricity. The American soldiers started going into the heart of the Sunni Triangle and into the insurgency. And I started doing my first military embeds to cover what their perspective was like. As a journalist, it's a great privilege to be able to cover many different sides of war. I covered injured soldiers for the first time, and these are the wounded coming out of the Battle of Fallujah. In 2004, I also started working in Darfur. It was very hard to access Darfur. I went in with a correspondent for the New York Times, and we couldn't get visas from the Sudanese government. So the only way in was to sneak across the desert from Chad into neighboring Sudan. And we met up with a truckload of rebels. There were 17 rebels on one pickup truck. And we literally climbed onto the top of the truck and held onto the ropes and drove around the desert for 5 days. And we were able to see the villages that were burnt out, women and men fleeing for their lives to get to neighboring Chad, and dead, littering the desert. The Sudanese government had gone in and bombed a village, and there was no way to access this village. One of the hardest things for anyone who covers war is actually access. There was one WFP helicopter going in to deliver food, and there were 8 WFP staff on that helicopter. And I was working with Lydia Polgreen for the New York Times at the time. And so we went to where the helicopter was taking off, and we said, we'd like to get on the helicopter so we can document this for the New York Times. And WFP said, no, there's no space. And Lydia went crazy, and she said, don't you know the power of an image? Don't you know that if this picture appears on the front page of the New York Times, people will care about Darfur? And that's exactly what happened. One person got off, I was able to get on the helicopter, and this picture appeared on the cover of the New York Times. And that picture was then used in Congress to talk about the war in Darfur. These are the displaced and people who had fled from that particular area waiting for food. And in 2006, the Sudanese government was ambushed by Darfur rebels. And President Bashir at the time went on TV and said, absolutely, that did not happen. And so Lydia and I snuck in to Darfur. We were in Chad again. We convinced a truckload of rebels to take us to this massacre site. We got there and there were bodies clear across the desert. And this picture again was on the front page of the New York Times, and we were able to prove that President Bashir was lying. This to me really symbolizes the power of an image and the importance of photography and of being there. In South Sudan, once South Sudan separated from North Sudan, I was able to start covering. I started covering with the referendum and have been going back every year. Civilians are always the victim of war. This is a young woman burying her daughter, her 3-year-old daughter, who was killed by a stray bullet during fighting. And there's gross malnutrition across the country. This is in Juba, the capital, and people waiting for food in Bentiu. It's a UN base in South Sudan. And this is young boy Chol, who was displaced by war. I went and met him in 2015 for the New York Times, the Displaced series. And when we met him, he was on the run. His village had been attacked by South Sudanese government soldiers. And his father was put in a hut and burned to death in front of him, but he was hiding in the bush at night. When I met him, it was about 3 months later, and he was running for his life to get to neighboring Kenya. And we spent a week with him in this swamp. I've since gone to see him in Kenya. He made it to Kenya. And I actually went back and found his mother in the bush in Lair, where she was living. And I was able to unite them with a video of his mother, a video message his mother made to bring to her son. And so I then brought it back to her. In 2009, I won a MacArthur Fellowship. And what I wanted to do was focus on maternal death and why women die in childbirth. Today, 800 women die every single day in childbirth. And that is almost half of what it was when I started this work, but it's still too many. This is in Afghanistan. I had gone to the remote provinces. One of the reasons women die in childbirth is because they can't get to a hospital. They can't get to a doctor. They can't get to a medical professional. So I was working in Afghanistan. I'm going to try and bring that back. And I was at the hospitals, and on the way back, we saw these 2 women on the side of the mountain. And because I had been working for a decade in Afghanistan at that point, I knew that women without a man was a problem, because all women are accompanied by a man in public, especially in the provinces. So we stopped the car and ran up and asked if something was wrong, and it turned out Noor Nisa, the woman on the right, was in labor. And her first husband's wife died in childbirth, and he was so determined to not lose her that he was able to get a car and bring her to the hospital. But when we met them, the car had broken down. So I said, well, just get in my car, I'll take you to the hospital. And they said, we can't, we need her husband's permission. But he had gone to look for another car. So I turned to Dr. Ziba, who was my translator, and I said, go find her husband. So luckily there was one road, and she went with our car and left me on the mountain with these 2 women, and she found the husband. And they all piled in the car, and we took them to the hospital, and she delivered safely. And everyone asked if I had taken more pictures after that, and I did not, because I changed the story with my presence there. She probably would not have made it to the hospital if I wasn't there. In 2010, I went to Sierra Leone. It's one of the other countries with the highest rates of women dying in childbirth in the world. When I went there, I went to the remote areas. Often a woman who's in labor shows up at a clinic, and this is what she finds. There are no doctors, no medical professionals. 1 in 8 women in Sierra Leone had a lifetime risk of dying in childbirth at the time. So I went to the Magbaraka Government Hospital. It was the hospital with one of the highest rates of maternal death. And when I went there, I met Mama Cisse. She was pregnant with twins. She had delivered the first baby in the village, and the second baby wouldn't come out. So she took a canoe across a river, got in an ambulance, and drove for 6 hours across bumpy roads when she still was pregnant with the other baby. This is when I met her. It was at the end of that journey, and we talked at length about her life and the fact that she was studying when she was 16, and her father made her get out of school so she can get married and have children. She was in so much pain and exhausted, but she finally delivered the second baby, and it was completely unresponsive. The midwives brought the baby back to life, but they forgot about Mama Cisse, and she started hemorrhaging. And I kept saying, I'm not a doctor, but I kept saying, she's bleeding a lot, is there something wrong? And they said, no, she's fine. And they were sort of mopping up the blood. And then she became more and more unresponsive, and there was 1 doctor in the entire province. And at that time in Sierra Leone, there were 3 obstetrician gynecologists in the entire country. So I went to the main operating theater where the one doctor was, and I actually put on scrubs and went into surgery and said, I think there's a woman dying. And he looked at me like I was crazy, of course. And I left, and I went back, and I said, maybe you should pick her up and bring her to the doctor. So that's what they did. And by the time she got to the doctor and he came out of surgery, she died. And this is her mother finding out that her daughter had just died in childbirth. And this is the funeral. So there is a good side of this story. After it was published, Time magazine did 8 pages, and there was an accompanying video. There was a doctor, Dr. Naveen Rao at Merck, the pharmaceutical company, and he saw this story, and he started just quietly showing it to board members at Merck. And they were so taken by the story that they put aside $500 million to fight maternal death. I started working on rape as a weapon of war in Congo in 2008, and these are some of the stories. And one of the things that I try and do as a photographer is to photograph in a way that will bring people in to ask questions. It's very difficult when you photograph hard stories because the natural instinct is to turn away. So for me, I try and really get you to look. I remember often when I photograph these women, they become pregnant as a result of rape as a weapon of war. And that is one of the goals of the perpetrators. And so I kept trying to think of ways that I can make people at home care about these issues. And I was thinking about the Annie Leibovitz photos of on the cover of Vanity Fair of Demi Moore, of Serena Williams. And I thought, I'm going to do the same thing. And so I met Ayak. She had been raped, gang raped actually, in South Sudan. And we spent a weekend together in a safe house. And she said, I really want to tell my story because I want to prevent this to happening to other women in South Sudan. And so first I photographed her with her dress on, and then I started thinking of these images of Annie Leibovitz's. And I went back the next morning, we woke up, and I said, Ayak, how do you feel about this? And before I even had the words out of my mouth, she took her dress off, and she was standing there, and I was showing her the pictures on the back of my camera, and she was completely comfortable with it, because in Africa there isn't such a taboo with breasts and the issues that we have in the US. And when this was published, it was very interesting for me to see the reaction, because people said, how could you do that to a woman? And I thought, well, why is it okay for Ayak to give permission? Because she's a South Sudanese, an African woman who was proud to show herself. But why is it not okay for her, but it's okay for a celebrity who makes that decision? So that was a very interesting discussion. In 2011, I was kidnapped in Libya and held for a week by Gaddafi's forces. When I was released, I promised my family I would not get kidnapped again, and so that was the second time. So when I got out, I started covering the humanitarian crisis of the war in Syria, and these are some of the pictures of refugees fleeing into neighboring countries, so northern Iraq, Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon. This is a woman living in a cave in Lebanon, and a young woman who was getting married off at 13 because her family was concerned that she might get sexually assaulted, living in such close proximity with other men in the camps. This is a young man fleeing with his family into Turkey, and a woman with her family at a refugee camp in Turkey. During the push of ISIS, I was photographing Iraqis and Syrians fleeing from ISIS into northern Iraq, and this is some of that work for the New York Times. And most recently, I started a year-long project for Time magazine where we followed 3 families displaced by war in Syria, and all 3 of the women were 8 months, 9 months pregnant when we met them. And the idea was to follow the newborn through a year of the newborn's life, no matter where they went in search of asylum. So we started with the families in Greece. 2 of the families are now in Germany. 1 was given asylum in Estonia, and 1 is still in Greece. So that was one of the babies. This is one of the women in labor. This is Suad finding out. She had no idea she had complications with her pregnancy because none of these women get prenatal care. So she found out in this moment she had to have a full hysterectomy because she had placenta previa, a complication, and that she might die. This is a birth of one of the mothers. This is Taima. She was suffering from postpartum depression with no help in a camp shortly after giving birth to her daughter Helen. And this is how they lived in the camp. This is in Greece. And this is Taima taking Helen to the hospital. She had the flu. A family, this is Noor bathing her baby in a camp. And this is Taiman and Mohammed getting asylum in Estonia, so flying for the first time. And when they arrived in Estonia, they were put in a village about a 3-hour drive out of the capital in the middle of the forest. And they were so depressed because they said, who will we talk to? Where have they put us? And this is them walking into their apartment complex. And so they fled Estonia and made their way to Germany, where they're trying to get asylum in Germany. And this is the first birthday of Helen, the baby that was on the cover of Time. And I'll show you one quick video that I made in combination with the Annenberg Foundation, the Annenberg Center for Photography. It was a story on refugees. It was a big exhibition that came out last year. And this is on the Rohingya. Ironically, this is before, obviously, everything that's happening now. And so I went in, I got permission to photograph, and here's a quick video.
Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist Lynsey Addario has traveled the world covering the horror of war and its aftermath. This is the first time she's been to Myanmar. She's here to document the plight of the Rohingya Muslims, a minority forced into internal displacement.
It's clear that it's very difficult to get access to the Rohingya and to photograph them.
This community lives confined to a small strip of land on the western coast. The only semblance of freedom they experience is by the sea.
They can't leave, they can't work, they know their boundaries.
Like right next to them here on this side.
In the hospital, things are much worse.
It's almost impossible for anyone to get any sort of medical treatment. They're not allowed outside of the camp, so they just die.
It's here that Lynsey meets Moriam Katu.
When I first met her, she was sort of just leaning against this wall crying because she was in so much pain, I imagine, and she just couldn't breathe. She basically knows she's dying this slow death, and there's no one to help her. She decided to go home.
Lynsey goes to the village looking for Moriam.
People need to understand the plight of refugees and the fact that no one wants to leave their home and no one wants to be a refugee. This is something that is forced upon people.
Shukriya. Can we come in? Can we come in? Depressing.
Finally, she finds Moriam.
She doesn't look good.
No.
Apparently 10 days after we left, she died.
So that's it. I just wanted to say that for me, I've been photographing now for 23 years, and I'm always looking for ways to try to bring these stories home to people who have power and the resources to make change. And that's one of my reasons for also doing speaking engagements and getting out there, because it's one thing to do the work and to put it in the New York Times or Time and National Geographic, which I've been very privileged to be able to do. But it's also nice to be here and to be able to talk to you all about the work. So thanks.